I was in seminary in 1979 when the Episcopal Church in America sought to update their then 200-year-old Book of Common Prayer that was only slightly changed from a much older Book of Common Prayer. The language of the old Book of Common Prayer was deeply rooted in the English of both Shakespeare and the King James Bible. My liturgy professor was an Episcopal priest who was on the front lines of the explosive controversy that was taking place within the Episcopal Church over this sudden modernization of their services. Anglophiles, it turns out, were less willing to make changes than Catholics had been 20 years earlier when Vatican II set aside their centuries of devotion to Latin in favor of the various languages where Catholic masses were being celebrated. One very staunch Episcopal lady was reported to have said, "If Jesus Christ could see this new prayer book, he would turn over in his grave." We've lived through several contentious reformations in the Protestant churches where I grew up and where I cut my teeth as a puppy preacher. I remember the hot debates about setting aside the King James Version of the Bible in favor of more modern translations. I watched my home church being torn apart by the momentous decisions of allowing a divorced elder to continue to be an elder in the church and to serve at communion. I remember the first time women were allowed to serve communion and to be elected to the church board and finally to be ordained and hired as disciples of Christ pastors. And of course, I've been in the thick of the battle to acknowledge the validity of same-sex relationships and to see gay people successfully given leadership positions in both the laity and in the clergy of our churches. The Disciples of Christ congregation that fired me a decade ago, largely for doing same-sex weddings, now has an openly gay pastor who was hired with his husband. So I don't know what the people that worked so hard to fire me are thinking about that now, but finally, change comes home. We talk a lot about the Reformation led by Martin Luther in the 16th century as a singular event. But in fact, religious reformation is going on all the time. Luther set a ball in motion that has given birth to literally thousands of variations of Protestantism. In fact, I would argue that the main branch of the Reformation led by Martin Luther, in many ways, surrendered after just a few generations and essentially went back to being Catholic in almost every meaningful way other than their name. No one would try to teach a science class today with a 50-year-old textbook. I've taken Spanish 3 times at Drury University, all in the last 10 years, and every time I had to buy a new textbook. I don't know that Spanish has really evolved quite that quickly. But the textbook industry knows a good thing when they see it, of course. But there are subtle updates going on all the time in every field of study. Only in religion do we seem to treasure finding out what flat earth shepherds in a wilderness believed about something 3,000 years ago, as if that is somehow more informed than what scientists can say today. But when it comes to religion, we tend to go backwards in time and to value ancient thought as if they knew something we can't know. Even in the pseudo-religions of New Age adherents, there seems to always be a claim to somehow having access to some ancient wisdom, almost all of which sprung up from the possibly deranged imagination of some modern eccentric. But still, their claim to legitimacy is that they are reintroducing Native American spirituality or Celtic or Druid or Egyptian insights. I have loved and benefited tremendously from yoga classes over the past 20 years, but I can hardly keep from giggling when some over-enthusiastic instructor calls out Hindi terms and claims to be showing us ancient Hindu practices. Folks, the cross-legged seated images you see in ancient Indian art and sculpture is not an example of their yoga instruction. This is how you sit when you don't have a chair. Very little yoga from even 100 years ago would appear to be even slightly familiar in a modern yoga studio. But there is some resistance to acknowledging that modern yoga practice is just good for you. It's good for you for lots of reasons that have nothing to do with ancient yoga practice. In fact, most of ancient yoga practice was a form of endurance and torture. It was not about exercise and flexibility and relaxation and meditation. That's a modern interest. Almost every part of modern yoga is not only not 5,000 years old, it was mostly developed in the West since 1960. That is to say, I am older than yoga. And I still can't sign up for Medicare for another 5 years. So it's not that ancient. Now, I'm a biblical scholar. I've spent years in grad school studying Christian and Jewish scriptures, and I've taken several classes in the ancient texts of other religious folks. All of those texts were written by people who do not know or did not know where the sun goes at night. The plays of William Shakespeare contain some amazing psychological insights into human character, but you would not use Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet as a psychology textbook. Just because something is centuries old does not mean that it is superior to modern wisdom. In fact, the literature of ancient religions reflect the very best understanding that they had in the world in which they lived. It was the best that they could muster. We do not honor their search for truth by denying the truth that is in front of us in deference to some artificial fealty to the maturity of their thoughts in past centuries. Who among us would want to go and see a 19th century dentist or an 18th century surgeon? Religions are languages, and they are languages tied to a very specific culture, wedded to a particular time in history. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. You cannot say that Korean is superior to French or Spanish to German. Religions express the core beliefs and values of the people and the particular place where they arose. We can learn from them, but that does not mean that one is better than another. In ancient Israel, when they were surrounded by hostile and competing tribes, it made sense for their survival for a man to have as many wives as they could afford to keep, to have as many children as possible. It did not serve the benefit of the community for a woman to have more than one husband or for same-sex relationships to exist. Homosexuality was discouraged because they needed more kids. Now, when the world is overpopulated, gay couples are doing the world a favor. And even in the time of Jesus, monogamy was praised over polygamy for the precise reason that they already had the land divided up, and having more folks was not in their best interest. By the time Israel was a settled land with all of the usable farmland taken up, polygamy was then described in their religious writings as a sin. Still, in the time of Jesus, divorce largely left women and children economically vulnerable, so divorce was condemned by the early church. But religions have to evolve to remain relevant in the modern world. 40 years ago, virtually every world religion just knew without a shadow of a doubt that homosexuality was a sin, a perversion. But 40 years ago, even the American Psychiatric Association had a diagnosis in their manual for mental health and diagnoses, that remained true right up until 1986. Now, I think most people in the world of clinical practice knew better, but the American Psychiatric Association did not remove homosexuality from diagnostic criteria until 1986. Still, in the presence of medical evidence and psychological research, they were slow getting to it, but the American Psychiatric Association was able to make changes in light of new facts and new understanding. We can't say that for Southern Baptists, Catholics, not much of Islam, not even all of Judaism. The sciences are largely eager to self-correct in the presence of new and better information. Religion has to do the same thing. There has to be a desire to be aligned with the truth. And when you discover new truths and new insights, religions have to change. But there's this sad and self-defeating propensity in organized religion to hold on to the past even when it is clear and obvious that the past is wrong. Amen. There are things that are morally, psychologically, and spiritually sick about a lot of ancient religious expressions of faith. So it is time, it's past time for a major reformation in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism, in Hinduism, and even in Buddhism. Changes that get past misogyny. We don't need to keep arguing about women's rights. We don't need to keep arguing about gay rights. We don't need to keep arguing about racism or even the exclusivism that my religion is better than yours, and the anti-intellectual superstitions that just are continuing to curse modern religions. We don't need to fight those fights over and over again. We need to move past it. In 1985, Robert Funk left his teaching post to start the Jesus Seminar, which was an effort of several hundred religious scholars to try and close the gap between the religious academies, what people were learning in graduate school, and what was being constantly repeated in actual churches. They wanted to bring the two together. He was infuriated by the fact that mainstream pastors would go to grad school for years, learn modern biblical critical skills, and then go into parish life and revert to repeating magic and superstition, albeit usually not because they had forgotten what they learned, but they were trying to keep from being fired. Now, I saw Bob Funk for the last time in January of 2005, just a few months before he died. I attended the Jesus Seminar meeting in Santa Rosa, California, and one of the founders of the Jesus Seminar, John White, was telling Robert Funk about what a good job he thought I was doing in introducing seminar scholarship into a mainstream church. Now, this was not typical for Bob, and I'm willing to lay a lot of this at the feet of his advancing cancer and the medications he was taking. But when he heard about what I was doing in the church, his face lit up, and he gave me a pretty good cussing in front of everybody in the seminar because I was still wasting time with churches. He had long ago given up on the church's ability to change, on the church's ability to let go of magical thinking and to become relevant again. In fact, Kathy was telling me her husband didn't come with her from Arkansas because he's convinced that all churches are evil, and if they're not evil right now, they're just one pastor away from becoming evil. So it's either me or the guy that comes after me or the woman that comes after me. Everyone listening to Bob Funk's little fit out in California was surprised that he was being quite so rude to me. The Jesus Seminar ostensibly existed to do exactly what I was trying to do. But 30 years after, when there was not much success to point to, Bob had given up, and he thought everybody else should too. And I understand why he had given up. I understand why so many progressive people of faith have given up on church. Most of you have invited someone to come with you to church, and you tell them, this is really different. This church is not like other churches. You're going to like this. But that word church, and they'll just say, no, I just don't go. And folks, I get it. I have seen the seamy underbelly of organized religion. I have been ravaged by its evil excesses. For years, I have suffered from public criticism from local pastors and church members who have accused me of not being a real Christian, that my beliefs were no longer the beliefs of the faith that they hold dear. Well, I've come to the point where I agree with them. Whatever it is that they believe that they call Christianity, I'm not one. I'm not a part of the club. Amen. I find no particular reason to be exclusively Christian. I find no particular reason to be exclusively Muslim or Jewish. We look for truth where we can find truth, wherever it can be found, whether that's in an ancient religious text or in a modern science book or math book. I long ago gave up on supernatural theism. I have no opinions about life after death. For me, faith, spirituality, church has everything to do with what is just and merciful and compassionate right here, right now. Amen. It has to do with ethics. It has to do with meaning, about creating a just society and in finding personal depth and fulfillment. Church is a place you go to learn. It's a place you go to be inspired, and at times even to be corrected. If you don't think I'm willing to tell you what you're doing wrong, just ask me. But mostly it's about being in community. Something about being around people who are, as I am, flawed, but trying, a little peculiar, but occasionally saintly, helps me to be a better person. And so I'm going to keep hanging out with you and hope more folks will join us. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.